The first person who called them married was an elderly flower seller beneath a striped awning. Single father Merrick Sloan had one hand on a loose lantern cable. Chief Executive Aurelia Vane was kneeling beside his daughter, fastening a tiny brass sunflower token to the girl's market bag. They looked less like a contractor and his client than a family that had forgotten anyone was watching. Aurelia did not correct the assumption. Then every lantern along the waterfront block dimmed at once. Merrick smelled heated insulation beneath the rain matting. A delivery cart had shifted a temporary power cover, crushing two connectors under cotton canopies packed with people. He opened the disconnect before the cable could arc. Aurelia closed the busiest lane even as a sponsor demanded the fare remain open. What began as a teasing mistake suddenly exposed a decision hidden inside the event plans. An indoor-rated distribution system had been approved for a damp waterfront street. By sunset, their almost family image would become the least complicated question either of them faced. Before we continue, tell us in the comments, where are you watching from? 6 hours earlier, the Marigold Waterfront Fair opened beneath a clear September sky. 3 brick streets between the old produce hall and the harbor had been closed to traffic. Canvas awnings shaded flower sellers, ceramic artists, food stalls, and repair demonstrations. Hundreds of warm globe lanterns crossed overhead on black cables, anchored to restored iron posts. Merrick Sloan had restored those posts and designed the permanent low-voltage lighting for the district. At 39, he had the tall, muscular build of a man who lifted cast-iron fixtures without rushing. His face was long and rugged, with green-gray eyes, a slightly crooked nose, a narrow scar through his lower lip, and dark chestnut hair swept into a textured wave. A close beard sharpened his jaw. For opening day, he wore a fitted pale-stone-ribbed knit polo with an open collar, tobacco-brown tailored trousers, a dark leather belt, and polished brown work boots. It was practical enough for inspection and fitted enough that his 10-year-old daughter, Tamsin, had approved. Tamsin carried a canvas market bag covered in hand-sewn patches. One empty loop waited near the front. Her mother had died 5 years earlier after a sudden aneurysm. Merrick never turned that loss into a reason the child had to remain fragile. Tamsin climbed ladders only when supervised, asked vendors difficult pricing questions, and believed every public event required a scavenger hunt. The missing item on her list was a brass sunflower token. For 80 years, longtime vendors at the waterfront market used stamped brass tokens to identify permanent stall rights. Modern permits had replaced them, but one elderly flower seller still gave miniature copies to children who could name 3 local flowers. Tamsin knew 7. Aurelia Vane arrived just before noon. She was 36, and impossible to mistake for a generic executive. Her glossy copper-chestnut hair fell in large polished waves over one shoulder. She had blue-green eyes, sculpted cheekbones, full rose lips, and a confident, curvy hourglass figure. Her powder blue silk wrap midi dress had a tasteful moderate neckline, fitted belted waist, and softly moving skirt. Gold earrings and tan leather heels completed the look. She looked glamorous beneath market string lights without appearing dressed for someone else's world. Aurelia led Vane Civic Markets, the private public company managing the waterfront district. Her job combined property operations, vendor contracts, preservation grants, and the uncomfortable duty of deciding which traditions survived redevelopment. Merrick's lighting contract had 3 days remaining. That fact mattered to both of them. They had spent 6 months discussing fixture temperatures, accessible stall spacing, and whether restored iron should look new. Attraction had appeared early and remained deliberately unnamed. Aurelia greeted Tamsin first. "Did you find the token?" "The flower lady says I need to identify one more plant." Aurelia examined the display. "Calendula." Tamsin narrowed her eyes. "That was my guess." "Then we can share the credit." The elderly seller laughed and stamped a small sunflower into a brass disc. Aurelia knelt to fasten it to the empty loop on Tamsin's bag. Merrick stood beside them, steadying a loose lantern cable while checking its strain relief. The seller looked between the three of them. "Your wife has better hands for tiny clasps," she told Merrick. Tamsin looked up immediately. Merrick opened his mouth, but Aurelia finished attaching the token and smiled. Why correct them? Her tone was playful, but the color beneath her cheekbones was not. The flower seller moved on to another customer, satisfied. Merrick lowered his voice. "You know Tamsin will treat that as evidence. She already has a spreadsheet, color-coded." Tamsin walked ahead, pretending not to listen. The moment could have become awkward. Instead, Aurelia stood close enough that the silk of her sleeve brushed Merrick's forearm. "Your contract ends Monday," she said. "I know. So do I." Before he could answer, the lanterns flickered. The entire East Lane dimmed to amber. Merrick smelled hot plastic. He followed the temporary feeder cable toward a black rubber crossing mat. A battery delivery cart had rolled over one edge and shifted the protective channel. Beneath it, two plug connectors were crushed together in damp grit. Their jackets had softened from heat. He did not touch them. He opened the upstream disconnect mounted on an iron post. The lanterns went dark, along with 12 stall outlets on the temporary circuit. Aurelia moved visitors away, while Merrick placed barriers around the mat. The event electrician arrived within minutes. He isolated the feeder, verified it was de-energized, and lifted the cover. The connectors were labeled for dry indoor use. The fair permit drawing specified weather-resistant locking connectors elevated from standing water. Rain was forecast before evening. A sponsor representative asked whether the lane could reopen on generator power. Merrick said no until the full temporary network was inspected. The representative turned to Aurelia. "We have media arriving at 4. She looked at the crowded cotton awnings, then at the damaged cable. "Close the East Lane," she said. "Compensate every affected vendor for today's fees and documented food loss." There was no dramatic spark and no crowd to applaud. The dangerous outcome was the one they prevented. By 1 o'clock, an independent event power inspector had been called. By 2, the fair's most profitable block was silent, and someone had already posted a photograph of Aurelia kneeling beside Tamsin while Merrick watched them like a husband who belonged there. The photograph spread because it was easier to understand than electrical distribution. Comments called Aurelia a secret wife, a new mother, and proof that Merrick had received the lighting contract through romance. None of those claims was true. Aurelia's communications director suggested a denial. She refused to use Tamsin in a statement. "Clarify the contract process and the lane closure," she said. "My private life is not a vendor safety announcement." Merrick appreciated the boundary. The independent inspector examined every temporary circuit. Of 24 connector pairs, 9 were indoor rated. 6 rested directly beneath crossing mats. The permanent lighting Merrick designed was compliant. The problem belonged to the event rental package. The rental company had proposed the correct weatherproof system. A procurement analyst later accepted a less expensive equivalent described as suitable for sheltered festivals. The phrase sounded reasonable on paper. It ignored wind-driven rain, street washing, and condensation beneath rubber mats. No worker had secretly exchanged the parts. An approval process had treated a waterfront street like an indoor hall. Aurelia ordered the entire temporary network replaced before reopening. Vendors could relocate to the permanent West Hall or receive compensation. The sponsor threatened to withdraw funding if the evening concert was canceled. "Then we will publish that decision beside the inspection report," Aurelia replied. The sponsor paused, reconsidered, and agreed to move the concert indoors. Merrick's contract created a separate problem. Because his firm had discovered the failure, Vane Civic Markets needed his technical records. Because Aurelia and Merrick had now become the subject of public speculation, neither wanted his work extended informally. An independent director approved a 2-day documentation amendment at Merrick's existing rate. Aurelia recused herself. Their almost date remained impossible until Monday. Tamsin treated the delay with suspicion. "Are you not dating because people think you are married?" "We are not dating because work is still active," Merrick said. "That is less interesting." Most honest answers are. The child spent the afternoon helping the flower seller move buckets into the West Hall. She did not handle power equipment or enter the closed lane. Her brass sunflower token stayed fixed to the bag. That token created the next question. While reviewing vendor compensation, Aurelia noticed that several legacy stalls appeared as temporary businesses in the new permit system. Their paper files carried old brass token numbers, but the digitized records did not. Temporary vendors received 1 day of lost fee compensation. Permanent stall holders qualified for documented inventory and relocation support. The classification error affected 17 families. Merrick's late wife had once sold illustrated maps at one of those stalls. He recognized the token format, but did not use his history to claim authority. Aurelia ordered a records audit. It found that the migration vendor had imported active leases, but omitted token-era occupancy credits stored in handwritten ledgers. The city had approved the new system after sampling modern accounts only. Again, there was no single villain. There was a definition that erased people who did not fit it. Aurelia expanded compensation based on evidence from rent receipts, tax records, and verified token ledgers. She invited vendor representatives to review the criteria before payments were issued. Some board members worried the correction would encourage fraudulent claims. "Then we verify claims," she said. "We do not preserve an error because correction requires work." Merrick watched her at the long produce hall table. She wore an ivory jacket over the powder blue dress, her hair pulled back, gold earrings removed. The glamorous woman from the photograph had not disappeared. She had simply become more precise. He understood why the public mistook their connection. They already moved around each other like people who trusted the same details. At sunset, rain reached the harbor. Water ran along the curb where the damaged connectors had been found. The replacement system remained elevated, locked and protected. The West Hall concert began without interruption. The following morning, Aurelia met affected vendors before she met sponsors. She did not ask them to praise the closure. A baker explained that moving indoors saved inventory but reduced foot traffic. A ceramic artist had packed fragile work twice. The flower seller lost no flowers, yet 2 assistants worked 6 extra hours during relocation. The compensation policy was revised to include documented relocation labor, not only damaged goods. Aurelia required her own operations team to record extra administrative time as part of the fair's true cost. Preventing an accident did not make disruption free, and responsible leadership meant counting burdens that never appeared in a press photograph. Merrick listened from the back of the hall. The choice did not make Aurelia heroic. It made her accurate, which impressed him more. Aurelia and Merrick stood beneath the awning with paper cups of coffee. "For the record," she said, "I did not mind the flower seller's mistake. For the record, neither did I. Monday. The inspection closed Sunday evening. Merrick's amendment ended Monday at noon. At 12:15, Aurelia sent him the address of a rooftop restaurant overlooking the market. Tamsin had already added it to the spreadsheet. Their first date began without a child, a contractor badge, or a communications director. Aurelia wore a fitted deep teal wrap dress beneath a cream coat. Merrick wore a dark navy jacket over an open-collar white shirt. The market lanterns glowed below them through permanent weatherproof fixtures. They discussed everything the photograph could not show. Aurelia had grown up inside family boardrooms where affection was often exchanged for loyalty. She feared being treated as a title more than being disliked. Merrick admitted that widowhood had made him efficient at refusing help. Parenting alone felt safer than allowing Tamsin to depend on someone who might leave. Neither confession became a promise. It made the second date possible. Their relationship grew in scheduled, ordinary steps. Aurelia attended Tamsin's school market project only after an invitation. Merrick never asked her to use company influence for his work. When Vane Civic Markets later needed additional lighting restoration, his firm either competed through an independent panel or declined. The fair investigation produced lasting changes. Temporary electrical substitutions required review by the designer of record or an independent qualified engineer. Outdoor connectors had to be photographed in place before energizing. Crossing covers could protect cables from traffic, but could not be used to hide plug connections. The vendor record audit restored permanent status to 14 of 17 applicants. 3 lacked enough evidence and entered an appeal process with independent review. No brass token alone became proof. The tokens became clues that the digital system had failed to preserve history. Aurelia created a vendor advisory council with rotating seats and paid participation. The elderly flower seller accepted the first seat only after confirming meetings included lunch. Merrick's permanent lights became part of the district rather than a monument to him. 1 year later, the Marigold Waterfront Fair opened again under a clear sky. Tamsin, now 11, managed the children's scavenger hunt table. Her brass sunflower token hung from the same patched bag. She had added a second empty loop but refused to explain it. Aurelia arrived in a fitted coral silk blouse, high-waisted cream trousers, gold sandals, and her polished copper chestnut waves loose over one shoulder. She no longer paused before joining Merrick and Tamsin in public. The flower seller looked up from a bucket of dahlias. "I remember you 3, she said. "Still married?" Merrick glanced at Aurelia. Their relationship had survived public assumptions because they never used those assumptions to rush private decisions. Aurelia smiled. "Not yet." Tamsin produced a second brass sunflower token from her pocket and clipped it to Aurelia's market bag. "This is not a proposal," the child said. "It is membership." Aurelia looked at Merrick, eyes bright. "Very official. Color-coded," he said. They walked toward the harbor holding hands while Tamsin ran ahead to inspect the lantern display. Above them, the restored iron posts carried permanent light through sealed connections. At their feet, temporary cables crossed the street in visible protected channels. Vendors old and new filled the blocks without being reduced to numbers a computer remembered or forgot. The photograph taken that morning showed 3 people laughing beneath a striped awning. Strangers would still decide what they saw. This time, the people inside the picture knew exactly what they were building.